I worked at City Hall. In my folder were building plans, application numbers, quarterly reports. I was never late, never broke protocol, never argued with my superiors. But then winter came, 12 degrees below zero. I stepped outside and saw children sleeping in the doorway of the building where my grandmother used to live, wrapped in blankets made from garbage bags. That night, I went back to the office, opened a blank file, and typed in a name no one had authorized me to enter. I didn't take bribes. I gave a chance. Or at least that's what I believed at the time. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was Rachel Howard, and I was 43 years old when I began to realize that the walls of the office where I had spent most of my adult life were closing in around me. I worked in the housing division of the Pittsburgh City Hall, a maze of beige hallways, low ceilings, and the faint, stale smell of burned coffee that never seemed to fade. My cubicle stood at the end of the corridor, where the light from the windows barely reached, and the hum of the fluorescent lamps replaced the rhythm of daylight. My desk was always immaculate, files stacked by category, reports arranged by date, pens aligned in a neat row beside my keyboard. Order was my form of control, my illusion of meaning. Every morning began the same way. I arrived 10 minutes before 8, hung my gray coat on the same hook, and waited for the computer to wake up. The screen flickered to life like a slow exhalation. My hands moved automatically, logging into the database, checking the list of pending applications, updating addresses, verifying forms. Paper over paper, number over number. My days were built from repetition, not purpose. People outside the building called it public service. Inside, it felt more like quiet decay. I had been there long enough to understand the patterns that nobody mentioned aloud. The families that got apartments faster because someone in the department owed a favor. The ones whose files vanished mysteriously after a phone call from the mayor's assistant. The waiting lists that grew longer every year, like some living thing feeding on promises. I wasn't naive. I didn't believe in fairness anymore, but I still believed in structure. The system was imperfect, but it was the only thing standing between chaos and survival. That was what I told myself when the guilt began to whisper. From my window, I could see the same narrow street every day, cracked asphalt, a flickering street light, a bus stop where people stood in silence. The faces changed with the seasons, but the posture stayed the same, waiting. That was the word that defined the city for me. Waiting for housing, for benefits, for someone to answer the phone, for winter to end. And inside City Hall, we were waiting too, waiting for policies that never arrived, for approvals that got lost somewhere between signatures and excuses. I had joined the department 20 years earlier, when I still believed that paperwork could be a form of justice. I was 23 then, newly graduated, wearing cheap heels that blistered my feet but made me feel taller, braver. I thought I was stepping into a career that meant something. The city was my cause, the desk, my battlefield. But years had a way of dulling edges. By 43, I no longer dreamed of reform. I dreamed of silence, of a day without broken printers and broken people. Sometimes I stayed late, pretending that the emptiness of the building gave me clarity. I could hear the janitor's cart rolling along the hall, the faint echo of a radio somewhere playing old country songs. The hum of the heating vents became almost human. I used to look at the endless rows of filing cabinets and imagine the stories trapped inside them. Families reduced to paper, lives translated into codes, errors, and approvals. Behind each application there was a face, a voice, a small act of hope. But by the time it reached my desk, it was just a case number, another item in the queue. The first time I noticed the shift was subtle. It was winter, A heavy one, when the city turned gray and wet and the wind carved through coats like knives. The line outside the municipal shelter stretched around the block. I passed it on my way to work every morning. People huddled together, faces buried in scarves, eyes dull from sleepless nights. I knew some of their names from my database. I knew who had been denied and why. Missing documents, unpaid fees, wrong signatures, technical reasons, bureaucratic reasons, reasons that kept the system running while real people froze. At my desk, I could hear the quiet desperation in their voices when they called. I had learned to speak in the language of regulations, to hide behind phrases like, "Your case is under review," or "Please resubmit the required forms." It was the voice of compliance, not compassion. I wasn't cruel. I was careful. I followed the rules. That was what made me reliable, what kept me invisible. And yet, there were nights when I lay awake, seeing the blank boxes on the forms, the ones labeled special circumstances. They were supposed to capture the human part of the story, but they rarely did. They were always empty. I remembered once attending a training session where a supervisor said, "The system is designed to protect itself, not the people." Everyone in the room laughed softly, like it was a joke, but I could tell it wasn't. We all knew the truth. The system was alive, and we were its organs, replaceable, obedient, and tired. My mother used to tell me that I had a steady heart, that I was made for quiet work. Maybe that was true. I didn't seek attention. I didn't challenge authority. I signed my name where it was needed and went home when the clock allowed. I kept my emotions folded inside me, pressed flat like papers in a drawer. But something in me had begun to ache, a small, persistent pain that had no diagnosis. It came from knowing too much and doing too little. On some days, I found small ways to feel human again. I brought coffee to the security guard downstairs, who was always half asleep during the morning shift. I helped a coworker fix a printer jam. I answered the phone even when it was supposed to roll to voicemail. They were trivial acts, but they made me feel like I still mattered. Yet even kindness had its limits inside that building. Eventually, the weight of indifference seeps into your bones. The city outside didn't care who I was. It swallowed names, faces, entire lifetimes without distinction. Sometimes, walking to the parking lot after dark, I passed by boarded-up buildings that once housed families. The plywood on the windows looked like eyelids forced shut. I wondered who had lived there, who had been waiting for the call that never came. The air smelled of rust and rain, and I thought about the files in my office, the empty apartment still listed as under maintenance. There was a particular sound I will never forget, the metallic clatter of the mail cart every morning. It rolled through the hallway like a heartbeat, delivering envelopes that carried hope or disappointment in equal measure. I would open each one, stamp it, and place it in the correct tray. To anyone watching, it looked like efficiency. To me, it felt like confession. Every stamp meant that someone's life had been decided by a process they would never understand. I told myself that detachment was necessary, that empathy would only slow me down. But detachment, once learned, is a dangerous habit. It starts as a way to cope and ends as a way to disappear. There were days I could barely feel the difference between right and procedural. They had blended into the same colorless tone that painted every corner of that building. If anyone had asked me then what I believed in, I would have said order. Order was safety. Order meant that things, even cruel things, happened for a reason. But deep down, beneath the routines and reports, I sensed the cracks forming. The illusion of control was fading. Somewhere between the printed forms and the empty houses, between the names that vanished from the lists and the children I saw huddled at bus stops, I began to understand that order without conscience was just another form of blindness. I didn't know it yet, But that winter would change everything. It would strip away the layers of habit and obedience until there was nothing left but the simple, unbearable question: what was I really protecting? The system or the people it was meant to serve? For now, though, I stayed where I was. I adjusted my chair, organized my files, and listened to the hum of the lights above me. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, I kept typing. The city was sleeping, and I was one of its quiet caretakers, faithful, invisible, and slowly running out of faith. It began as something small, almost invisible, like the shift in the air before a storm. A decision that should have taken seconds on a screen, but took root somewhere deeper. The woman came in on a Monday morning when the hallways still smelled of wet coats and old coffee. She didn't have an appointment. She stood quietly by the reception desk, holding a child who looked too light for his size. His jacket was 2 sizes too big, his shoes soaked through. I remember the way her fingers trembled as she handed over a crumpled folder, and how her voice, soft but steady, broke through the usual noise of phones and printers. She wasn't begging, she was explaining. There was a difference, and I heard it. Her file landed on my desk by coincidence, or maybe by something that felt like fate disguised as paperwork. The case was simple on paper: one mother, one child, no current employment verification, therefore denied. A line of text that canceled the possibility of warmth, safety, rest. The rules were clear. I had followed them for years without hesitation. But that morning, the lines of text blurred, and I couldn't stop seeing her hands, the way they clutched the folder like it was something alive. The apartment listed in her file had been vacant for nearly a year, sitting in bureaucratic limbo while new regulations waited to be approved. I remembered the address. I had seen it once during an inspection. The hallway smelled of dust and paint, the walls half peeled, the rooms echoing with the sound of nothing. It wasn't perfect, but it was shelter, and still the system had chosen to let it rot. That realization began to fester in me like a wound I couldn't ignore. When I opened her application, the database blinked with that familiar coldness of formality. Incomplete documentation. Verification pending. I knew how to fix it. I knew which boxes to tick, which codes to adjust. Years of following the rules had taught me exactly where they could be bent. My fingers hovered above the keyboard longer than they ever had. I could almost hear the hum of the fluorescent light above me, like it was warning me to stop. But something heavier than caution guided my hand. I typed her name into the empty field. The system accepted it without question. A single click, and she moved from denied to approved. It felt like watching a locked door open without a key. For a long moment, I just sat there. My heartbeat filled the silence. The office around me went on with its normal rhythm. The tapping of keys, the soft laughter from the next cubicle, the sound of the printer spitting out another form destined for someone else's waiting. But for me, the air had changed. The walls felt closer, the light harsher. I had crossed something invisible, and there was no undoing it. The following week she returned, wearing the same coat, the same tired expression. She didn't recognize me as the person who had touched her record. To her, I was just another official handing her the papers she had prayed for. Her gratitude was quiet, almost fragile. She signed where I told her to, took the keys, and walked out into the gray afternoon with the boy asleep on her shoulder. I watched them leave through the glass doors, their figures shrinking until they blended with the snow outside. I told myself I had done the right thing. I told myself I had simply corrected an oversight. But the truth was different. The truth was that I had rewritten reality, and no one had given me permission. The first night after that, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the name in the system, glowing quietly in digital ink. It was still there, a silent rebellion buried beneath 1,000 lines of code. I imagined someone finding it, a supervisor, an auditor, someone more loyal to the rules than I had ever been. But no one did. The next morning, everything looked the same. The city didn't collapse. The building didn't burn. The world went on as if nothing had happened. That was the most dangerous part. How easy it was. The second time came more easily. A family this time. 2 parents, 3 children, their record flagged for further review. I remembered the way their youngest daughter had drawn on the waiting room wall with a piece of broken crayon. A tiny sun, uneven but bright. I pulled up their application late one evening when most of the office had already gone home. The hum of the air vents filled the silence like a pulse. Again, I made the changes. I knew exactly which line to edit, which form to duplicate, which code to alter, so that it looked like nothing had ever been missing. It was a rhythm, a language I had learned to speak fluently in secret. Soon, it became a ritual. I stayed late under the pretense of backlog. I worked through lunch hours, claiming dedication. But what I was really doing was erasing evidence of the system's indifference, replacing it with something human. Each time I entered a name, I imagined the sound of a key turning, the warmth of a light flicking on inside a dark room. It was intoxicating, the power to undo injustice with a few keystrokes. I began to understand why corruption didn't always start with greed. Sometimes it began with mercy. No one noticed, or maybe no one wanted to. In an office built on monotony, nothing stood out for long. Files moved through hands like coins through a slot machine. Input, process, result. The difference between a life changed and a life discarded was just one unchecked box. I learned to breathe quietly, to blend in, to let the current carry me. My rebellion lived in the spaces between reports and signatures, in the white noise of fluorescent light. I had found a way to cheat the system without leaving fingerprints. But the act began to change me. There was a thrill in it, yes, but also a deep unease. Each approval brought a small surge of warmth, followed by a chill that settled in my bones. I began to look at everyone differently. The people waiting in line, my coworkers, even my reflection in the bathroom mirror. I wondered how many of them carried secrets that looked like kindness from the outside. I started to notice how easily righteousness could disguise itself as salvation. Some nights, after locking up, I walked through the city alone. I passed the buildings whose names I had typed, whose doors now opened for people who would never know mine. Sometimes lights burned in the windows, curtains drawn, a child's laughter echoing faintly down the street. I stood there, hands buried in my pockets, and told myself that this was proof I had done something good. But good things built on false foundations never stand for long. I think I knew that already, though I refused to admit it. I didn't take money. I didn't seek recognition. I wasn't trying to be a savior. I was just tired of watching people drown while holding the rule book that told me not to swim. Each name I entered felt like an act of defiance against something I no longer believed in. And yet, beneath that defiance, there was fear. The kind of fear that doesn't scream but whispers, reminding you that one wrong glance, one audit, one question too many could unravel everything. The computer became my confessional. The click of the mouse, my prayer. I worked carefully, methodically, ensuring the dates matched, the logs aligned. It was meticulous work, almost beautiful in its precision. I told myself that if I was going to break the rules, I would at least do it flawlessly. That was how I justified it, by calling it competence. Weeks passed. The winter deepened. The shelters overflowed. The names kept coming, and I kept typing. I told myself I was restoring balance, but in truth, I was drifting further from it. There's a strange point where compassion turns into obsession, where the need to fix something broken becomes a hunger that can't be satisfied. I had reached that point without realizing it. I began to feel watched, though no one had said anything. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe it was the natural consequence of guilt. My coworkers chatted about weather, holidays, deadlines. Their laughter sounded distant, artificial, as if it came from another world. I existed between screens and silence. The world outside my cubicle felt blurred, like I was underwater. Only the glow of the monitor seemed real. Still, I didn't stop. How could I? Once you've seen the cracks, it's impossible to unsee them. Once you've stepped beyond the boundary, every return feels like betrayal. So, I kept doing what I did best. I filled the empty spaces. I turned denied into approved. I made the system breathe, even if it was only through borrowed air. And every time I pressed save, I heard the faintest echo inside me, like the sound of a lock turning both ways at once. There came a point when I stopped wondering if I was doing the right thing and started wondering when someone would notice. The longer I continued, the quieter the line became between bending the system and breaking it. At first, my decisions felt like whispered corrections in the margins of a flawed manuscript, but soon they became entire paragraphs rewritten. And in those revisions, I had forgotten one crucial fact. The system, even when it fails, always watches. It began with a knock on my office door, light, almost polite. A woman in a camel coat stood in the frame, holding a clipboard and wearing a smile so practiced it looked carved. She introduced herself as a representative from the District Compliance Board. She said she was conducting a routine review of the department's efficiency metrics. Her eyes lingered too long on the folders stacked neatly at the edge of my desk. I told her everything was in order. She nodded, took notes, and left without further questions. But when the door closed behind her, I felt it. Not suspicion, not accusation, but presence. From that day on, I worked with the weight of her gaze still hanging in the room. I began triple-checking everything. I erased the breadcrumbs I had once left without care. I scanned approval logs late into the night, cross-referencing dates and timestamps, deleting anything that looked too clean, too fast. But the fear was already under my skin. It moved with me through the halls, curled in the corner of my office, echoed in the elevator doors that closed just a beat too slowly. I told myself I had covered my tracks. I told myself I was just being cautious. But the truth was simpler. I was being watched, and I knew it. Then the news came, not through the department, but in the early hours of a Tuesday morning. I read it in the email digest we all ignored until boredom forced us to skim. A woman had died. Overdose, found in a subsidized apartment on the east side of town. The address punched me in the chest. I had cleared her file 6 months ago. She was one of mine, one of the names I had pulled from the margins and written into the system like a lifeline. Her name was Angela. I remembered her handwriting on the intake form, shaky but precise. She had a daughter, though the file never said where the girl had gone. I stared at the screen, unable to move. My coffee had gone cold. The office around me hadn't noticed yet. Phones were ringing, copiers stuttered. Someone laughed 2 desks away. But I couldn't hear anything beyond the words. No foul play suspected. I thought about the key I had handed her, the apartment I had called a second chance. I wondered if she had died alone. I wondered if, in the last minutes, she had regretted trusting someone like me. A week later, the audit became official. They didn't storm in with handcuffs or sirens. It was far quieter, more meticulous. Men in suits, their badges clipped to belts, began asking for logs. They requested files I hadn't touched in months, maybe years. They smiled, thanked us for cooperation, spoke in the polite dialect of dismantling lives without raising their voices. I sat at my desk, performing the ritual of normalcy, but my stomach was a knot of wires. I knew it was only a matter of time. Eventually, they asked to speak to me directly. I was escorted into a small conference room where a man with a kind face and a legal pad waited. He offered me water. I declined. He asked about dates, about forms, about approval codes I had memorized, and then buried. I answered carefully, letting the silence stretch between us when I didn't know what to say. I realized I had rehearsed for this moment in my head, but reality was slower, heavier. I wasn't afraid of jail. I was afraid of seeing everything I had done turned into evidence. I went home that night and stared at my ceiling until morning. My apartment felt unfamiliar, like a borrowed space. I walked from room to room, touching objects as if to prove they still belonged to me. My reflection in the mirror looked older than it had a week ago. There was something about waiting for a punishment that changed the shape of time. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even ashamed. But I felt emptied, as if someone had quietly removed all the furniture inside me and left the lights on. The formal charges came later: falsifying government documents, misuse of public authority, unauthorized housing assignments. The language of law was sterile, almost elegant. It drained every drop of intent from what I had done, reduced it to violations, numbers, and penalties. There was no space in those paragraphs for children warming their hands over radiators, or mothers sleeping without fear for the first time in years. The court didn't care about the curtains in the windows or the footsteps in the hallway. It cared about codes and precedents. And in its eyes, I was just another name, an outlier, an anomaly, a case study in administrative misconduct. I sat through the trial in a silence that felt like armor. My lawyer advised minimal responses. I nodded, answered plainly, and looked straight ahead. The prosecutors didn't paint me as malicious, but that didn't matter. The system punishes deviation, not motivation. When the verdict came, I felt nothing. No burst of panic, no sinking dread. Just a hollow stillness, like standing in an empty room where a party had once been. I had prepared for this. I had known it was coming. And when the sentence was read, I bowed my head, not in shame, but in acknowledgement. This was the cost. This was the other side of mercy. In the days that followed, I packed my things in small boxes, labeled them with soft black ink. I left my plants on the windowsill of the office, hoping someone would remember to water them. My resignation was processed before I even had the chance to hand it in. The city moved quickly when it needed to clean its own reflection. I was erased from email chains, removed from system logins, forgotten with efficiency. That was the part I hadn't anticipated, the ease with which I could be unmade. On my last morning as a free woman, I stood outside the building and looked up at the windows where I had once spent my days. The glass reflected the sky, indifferent and wide. I thought about the people still inside, filing reports, approving applications, deleting names. I wondered if any of them had ever felt the line shift under their feet, the way I had. I wondered how many more would. As I turned away, I realized something had shifted inside me. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't sorry, not in the way they wanted me to be. But I understood now, with a clarity that had taken years to earn, that justice isn't a place you reach. It's a question you carry. And some questions, once asked, have no answer that fits neatly in a file. I walked away from the building with my head high, not because I had won, but because I had chosen. And in a world governed by silence and systems, that, perhaps, was the loudest thing I had ever done. They said the transport would arrive at 6 a.m., but I had been awake since 4. I didn't sleep that night, not from fear, not exactly. It was a kind of waiting that hollowed me out from the inside. My apartment looked unfamiliar, like a hotel room emptied too slowly. The floor still held the shape of where the rug had been. My books remained on the shelf, untouched, their spines quietly watching me from across the room. I hadn't packed much: a few clothes, a small Bible someone had given me years ago, a photo I wasn't sure I'd be allowed to keep. The rest would stay behind. Objects didn't follow you into prison. They stayed where the light was. Outside, the morning was colorless, wrapped in a winter haze that softened the edges of the buildings. A man in uniform knocked once and waited. He didn't smile. He asked my name, then gestured toward the unmarked car with plastic seats and no handle on the inside. I sat in the back, my hands resting on my knees, and looked out the window as the city I had lived in for 20 years began to dissolve behind fogged glass. The courthouse, the bridge, the park where I used to walk during lunch breaks. Gone, gone, gone. They didn't speak during the drive. The radio was off. The silence was too thick to break, too official. It felt like we were all pretending this wasn't real, that the engine wasn't taking me to a place I couldn't leave. I tried to count the streetlights as we passed them, tried to mark time in flickers and glows. It didn't help. Nothing did. When the gates appeared, tall and gray, wrapped in coils of barbed wire like a crown of thorns, something inside me turned cold. I had seen photos before. I had read reports. But nothing prepares you for the first moment when your future is wrapped in concrete and surveillance. The car slowed. The guardhouse opened. We passed through one set of gates, then another. Each one closed behind us like a breath held too long. Intake was as mechanical as I'd imagined. I was told to remove my clothes. I was given new ones, stiff, ill-fitting, stamped with numbers instead of names. I was fingerprinted, photographed, searched. My belongings, the few I had, were inventoried and placed in a plastic bag. A woman read rules in a voice stripped of any emotion. I nodded where appropriate. I didn't ask questions. It didn't matter. The walk to my cell block was long. The hallways smelled of bleach and something older, harder to name. The air was heavy, thick with tension, but also something quieter: resignation. It clung to the walls like moisture. We passed other women. Some glanced up, most didn't. Their eyes were dull, like glass that had forgotten how to reflect. I felt their looks before I saw them. Not curiosity, not malice, just recognition. A new arrival. Another soul filed into the system. My cell was small, just wide enough to stretch my arms if I stood in the middle. A bunk bed, a metal toilet, a sink that dripped in uneven rhythms. The walls had once been painted white, but had since turned the color of old snow. The mattress was thin, the pillow thinner. A gray blanket lay folded at the edge. I sat on the lower bunk and looked at my hands for a long time. They didn't feel like mine anymore. The first night, I didn't cry. I listened. I learned the sounds: the clatter of dinner trays being pushed along steel rails, the distant echo of someone yelling from another block, the periodic buzz of the intercom, the clink of keys turning in locks. Time moved in fragments. There was no night or day, just light and its absence, noise and its absence. My cellmate was already there when I arrived. She didn't speak. She pointed to the top bunk and returned to whatever she was writing. I didn't ask her name. She didn't ask mine. In this world, introductions meant little. Survival didn't need conversation. It needed silence, awareness, and the ability to disappear. Days passed like water dripping from a cracked pipe, slow, relentless, without meaning. We were woken at 5, counted, fed, counted again, assigned work, counted again, lights out at 9. Then it all began again. Every action was choreographed, every movement monitored. It didn't take long for the rhythm to sink into my bones. I stopped checking the date. I stopped thinking about what day it was. Time became a hallway with no exits. I swept floors in the visitation building. I liked that job because it brought me closer to voices that still had hope in them. Children pressing their palms to glass, mothers fixing their hair in the reflection, men trying to smile through shame. I moved around them like a shadow, broom in hand, eyes lowered. Sometimes I saw women I recognized, former applicants, names I had once typed into databases. I never said anything, neither did they. Perhaps we were both afraid to admit how easily the lines between us had blurred. It was there, sweeping between plastic chairs, that I started to understand something the outside never taught me. Prison wasn't just confinement, it was erasure. It took your voice, your rhythm, your sense of sequence. It left you hollowed out and replaced your insides with protocol. You weren't a person anymore. You were a file, a risk factor, a line on a chart. They fed you, clothed you, gave you numbers and schedules, but they didn't let you be real. I wrote letters I didn't send, to people I missed, to people I had failed. I wrote to the city itself sometimes, as if it were a person with a conscience. I told it about the peeling paint, the cold floors, the woman in the cafeteria who cried when the lights flickered. I told it how we all still had names, even when no one used them. No one came to visit me. I didn't expect them to. I had made peace with the silence. The only thing I feared now was forgetting who I had been. I clung to routines. I made my bed with corners so sharp they looked like paper folds. I folded my blanket the same way every morning. It was the only place where I still had control. One evening, I found a scrap of mirror wedged into the crack of the wall. Just a shard, no bigger than a palm. I stared into it, barely recognizing the face that looked back. My hair was shorter, my eyes more tired, but it was the mouth that struck me, the way it never smiled, not even reflexively. I hadn't realized how long it had been since I had smiled. That night, I dreamed of doors. Hundreds of them, all the same size, all painted the same dull gray. I walked past them, trying to find one that would open. None did. I woke up with my fists clenched and my heart pounding. It wasn't fear, it was grief. Grief for the version of me that had believed good intentions were enough. Grief for the people I couldn't save. Grief for the fact that I was now one of them. There was a day, sometime in the second month, when I heard a woman laugh, really laugh, in the yard. It startled me. It sounded like rebellion. It reminded me that even in places designed to break you, some pieces refuse to snap. I held on to that sound. I let it echo in my chest during the nights when I couldn't sleep, when the cold reached through the thin blanket and wrapped around my spine like ice. By then, I understood. This wasn't a place of justice. It was a destination, a one-way ticket. It didn't care why you came. It didn't care who you helped or hurt or tried to protect. It only cared that you stayed in your place, that you followed the line, that you disappeared just enough to keep the machine moving. And so I did. I followed the rules. I folded my clothes. I swallowed my opinions. But I didn't disappear, not entirely. A small part of me remained untouched. It watched. It listened. It remembered. And in that remembering, there was still something dangerously close to hope. Prison time was not linear. It stretched and curled, folding in on itself like smoke. Some days passed with the weight of centuries. Others vanished before I realized they had begun. I learned to live not in hours or weeks, but in fragments, in the sound of metal clinking against metal, in the exact moment the morning light shifted through the bars, in the brief silence just before the intercom crackled to life. That silence was sacred, half a breath of autonomy in a place built to erase you. I had become part of the machinery. I followed rules, nodded on command, walked in step. But there was a part of me, a quiet, steady part, that refused to vanish. It lived in my spine, in my fingertips, in the space between my teeth when I clenched my jaw to keep from speaking. It watched. It waited. It remembered who I had been and who I might still be. They assigned me to clerical detail in the prison library. It was ironic. I once had an office filled with forms and files, digital systems, and spreadsheets. Now I had a rusted cart of returned books and a half-broken hole punch. But I took to the work quickly. Organizing brought comfort. Each book had a place. Each label told a story. There was no bureaucracy to navigate, no silence at the other end of the phone, just paper, dust, and the rhythm of shelves breathing in and out. The other women came in pairs, sometimes alone. Some read romance novels with tattered covers. Others pretended to read but really just wanted the quiet, the illusion of solitude. I began to notice who avoided eye contact and who stared too long, who read quickly and who turned pages just to touch something soft. They didn't ask me questions, but slowly, over time, they left small offerings: half a candy bar, a folded note, a book already renewed 3 times. I helped where I could. I showed them how to use the catalog system, how to request materials from the legal section, how to navigate the cryptic coded index cards left over from another decade. One woman came in looking for information on family court proceedings. I found the manual she needed and tucked a yellow post-it on the page with the statute most relevant to her case. She didn't say thank you, but the next week she left a piece of string on my desk, braided from old t-shirt threads, tied in a tight, deliberate knot. It meant more than words. Word got around that I knew things, that I could explain legal language in plain terms, that I listened without interrupting. I became a resource, unofficial and unseen. They brought me letters from parole boards, documents for appeal, pages from old case files. I sat cross-legged on my bunk with a pen behind my ear and a dictionary in my lap, deciphering their pasts, helping them make sense of systems built to confuse. There was something healing in that, not redemptive, not in a grand cinematic way, but quietly restorative, like planting something in soil you thought was dead. I wasn't trying to atone anymore. I wasn't trying to justify what I had done. I was simply trying to be useful, to prove that I still had value beyond the number stitched into my uniform. Some days I imagined myself back at my old desk, the hum of the monitor, the weight of decisions in my hands. But those were ghosts. I knew now that what I had once called justice had been, at best, a kind of controlled blindness. The system didn't see people. It saw patterns, boxes, exceptions, red flags. It moved too fast to recognize suffering unless that suffering slowed it down. I had tried to slow it, and for that, I had been erased. But here, among the forgotten and discarded, I found a strange kind of clarity. The rules were cruel, but they were transparent. The guards didn't pretend to care. The forms didn't pretend to help. There was no mask here, no performance, just raw need and the daily act of surviving. One night, lying on my bunk, I reread a letter I had written but never sent. It was addressed to no one, or maybe to myself. I had written it after a woman I'd been helping was denied early parole. Her name was Marta. She had 3 children and a quiet voice that always made people lean closer. Her file was clean, her record spotless, but the system found a flaw, a missed therapy session 6 months prior. It was enough. It always was. She didn't cry when they told her. She just folded her arms and said, "I knew it." That night, I wrote until my hand cramped. I wrote about injustice, about the hollow cruelty of technicalities. I wrote about how it feels to hope in a place designed to crush you. I wrote until the words blurred and the ink bled into the paper. Then I folded the letter into fourths and placed it beneath my mattress. I didn't need to send it. Writing it was enough. It reminded me I was still capable of feeling. In the mornings, I began to rise early, not because I had to, but because it gave me an hour of stillness. I stood by the small window, watching the sky change from black to blue to bruised gray. I breathed in the silence. I made a habit of naming things I was grateful for: hot tea, the smell of books, a guard who didn't shout. It was a small act of resistance, a way to reclaim a fragment of my humanity. Occasionally, I thought about the people I had once helped, those I had placed in apartments with forged approvals and unauthorized signatures. I wondered where they were now. Some, I imagined, had moved on, found work, rebuilt. Others, perhaps, had fallen through cracks too deep to climb out of. I would never know. That unknowing hurt the most, not because I needed recognition, but because it meant that what I had risked everything for might have already crumbled. One afternoon, a woman I barely knew passed me a note in the corridor. It was written in pencil on a torn piece of cardboard. It read, "You helped my sister. She's okay now. She said thank you." There was no signature. I didn't need one. I carried that note with me for weeks, hidden in the lining of my shoe. Time moved on. Seasons changed, though the view never did. Inside, we marked spring by lighter uniforms and fall by the smell of burned leaves carried in on someone's coat. I learned to read moods like weather. I knew when a fight was about to break out, when someone had received bad news, when a cell block was about to be locked down. I moved carefully, deliberately, without drawing attention. I had become fluent in the language of caution, but I never stopped helping, even when it tired me, even when it brought more eyes. It was the only way I knew how to keep from breaking. In a place designed to flatten you, doing something useful, no matter how small, was an act of defiance. I began keeping lists in my head, names of women who smiled again, documents that made it to the right desk, sentences reduced, visits approved. They were small victories, each one a thread pulled loose from a suffocating net. I held on to them like lifelines. Sometimes I imagined what release might feel like. I didn't picture parades or reunions or redemption. I pictured quiet. I pictured walking down a street without counting steps. I pictured not being watched. I didn't know if that would ever happen, but I held the image close, tucked beside all the other small things that made the days bearable. I lived in the in-between, between punishment and forgiveness, between the past and whatever waited on the other side, between the person I used to be and the person I was becoming. I didn't ask to be absolved. I asked only for the strength to continue. And every morning, when the lights buzzed on and the day began again, I chose to try. That was what it meant to live between sentences, not to hope for escape, but to insist, quietly and fiercely, that your soul would not be erased. They called it Release Day, but it felt more like a layover between lives. I stood in a room that smelled like old air and ammonia, wearing clothes that no longer fit the way they used to. The waistband sagged, the sleeves pulled. Everything about me felt stretched and reassembled, like a painting someone had tried to restore without knowing the original colors. My belongings, what little I still had, fit into a plastic bag with a red zip tie. One pair of shoes, a wallet with no cash, a folded paper with a phone number I hadn't dialed in years. I held it all like a tourist clutching a map in a country that no longer existed. The guard who escorted me out didn't speak. He pressed the button, waited for the door to buzz, and walked 10 paces behind me until we reached the exit gate. That final threshold wasn't ceremonial. It didn't open with light or fanfare. Just a groan of rusted metal and a gust of wind sharp enough to make me blink. I stepped through and stood still, waiting for something. Recognition, clarity, collapse. Nothing came, Only sky, too wide. Only silence, too loud. A van waited at the curb, its engine running like a question no one wanted to ask. It wasn't taking me home. I didn't have one. It was taking me to a halfway place, a shelter on the edge of the city that smelled of wet concrete and instant coffee. They called it transitional housing. That word, transitional, clung to me for weeks. It meant temporary, unstable, between things. A place where people landed when they were no longer punished, but not yet trusted. A place for people like me. I shared a room with two other women. One snored like thunder. The other cried in her sleep, breath hitching like a skipping record. There was no privacy, no quiet, just paper-thin walls, flickering lights, and the sound of second chances being negotiated in whispers and phone calls that rarely ended well. During the day, we lined up for food, for job applications, for group meetings where we talked about accountability and purpose and routine. I said the right things. I filled out the forms. I kept my head down. Finding work was like trying to sell a story no one wanted to read. My resume was a relic from another era, stained with gaps and ghosts. I tried shelters, call centers, cleaning services. Some never called back. Others smiled and nodded and told me they'd keep me in mind. One woman, a manager at a thrift store, looked me in the eye and said, "We don't hire ex-felons, sweetheart." I nodded, thanked her, and left before the heat in my face turned into something I couldn't swallow. Weeks passed. My days blurred. I woke at dawn, dressed in the same jeans, took the same bus routes to the same rejections. I memorized the cracks in the sidewalk, the ads in the subway cars, the names on the plastic badges of social workers who rotated too fast to remember mine. I learned how to speak just enough, smile just enough, not take up too much space. I lived like an apology. Eventually, I found a job at a nonprofit downtown, a place that helped women re-enter society after incarceration. They didn't pay much, but they didn't ask for explanations either. I stocked shelves in the donation room, made tea for support group meetings, folded clothing that came in trash bags and left in plastic totes. The building had fluorescent lights and creaky stairs and posters peeling off the walls. But it also had warmth, the kind that came not from pity, but recognition. We were all building something from broken pieces, and we did it without pretending they weren't broken. Some days I saw faces I recognized. A woman I had once approved for housing before my conviction. A teenager I had met in the prison library, now sitting across from me with her hands wrapped around a styrofoam cup. We didn't always speak, but there was a nod, a glance, a moment when the distance between who we had been and who we were trying to become disappeared. I kept to myself. I arrived early, stayed late, swept the floors even when no one asked me to. The rhythm of work soothed something in me. It reminded me that time could be filled with usefulness instead of punishment. I no longer tried to rewrite the system. I no longer believed I could fix what had never been designed to serve everyone equally. But I could offer a seat, a warm drink, a folded coat, small things that didn't ask permission. Sometimes, on my way home, I passed buildings that had once been familiar. Old housing units, now boarded up. Windowless facades covered in graffiti and dust. I'd stop and stare at them, not with nostalgia, but with a dull ache. I remembered the spreadsheets, the codes, the blank fields I had filled with names. I remembered how easy it had been to think I was doing something noble. I wasn't sure anymore, but I remembered. I lived in a rented room in the back of someone's house. The walls were thin, and the heat clicked on with a metallic groan. There was a small lamp on the nightstand and a chair by the window where I liked to sit in the evenings. I didn't decorate. I didn't hang pictures. I wasn't sure I was staying. Every Sunday, I bought a cup of coffee from the same shop and sat on the same bench outside the park. I watched people pass, families, joggers, lost tourists looking at maps. No one looked at me. I liked it that way. I wasn't invisible anymore. I was just someone in the middle of a moment. Letters started arriving from the Department of Corrections, surveys, reminders, forms. I filled them out carefully, printed in block letters, as if the steadiness of my handwriting could erase the instability of my status. One form asked, "Do you feel rehabilitated?" I stared at the question for a long time. I didn't know what it meant. Was rehabilitation a return, a reinvention, or just a quieter kind of surrender? I left the line blank. One evening, after a long shift at the nonprofit, I found a note on my locker. No name, just 5 words written in ballpoint pen. "You helped more than you know." I read it twice, then again. I folded it into quarters and placed it in the pocket of my coat. That night, I sat in my room with the note in my lap, and the window cracked open just enough to let in the sound of the city. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed. Somewhere inside, something settled. Freedom wasn't what they promised. It didn't come wrapped in celebration or clean slates. It came in pieces, in the first paycheck that barely covered groceries, in the ache of being trusted with a key again, in the decision to stay, day after day, even when leaving would be easier. It came in the quiet act of living without hiding. I still dreamed of the past sometimes, of corridors and cells and voices echoing off concrete. But those dreams no longer held me. I had begun to build a different narrative, one that didn't start with the system or end with it, one that belonged to me. I wasn't looking for redemption. I wasn't chasing forgiveness. I was rebuilding a life, one shelf at a time, one name at a time, one evening at a time. I had no destination in mind, only movement. Forward, always forward. Freedom, I realized, was not the gate that opened. It was the choice to keep walking long after it closed behind you.